Greetings. This is our bi-weekly office hours video. So twice a month, answering questions from the members of the Tantrik Yoga Now Facebook group. So that's what we're doing. We'll get right into it. There's questions that were posted in the last, 48 hours, I guess. And I'll do my best to answer some of these. Peter says, can you explain some other parts of Tantra regarding devatas and homa rituals? You always discuss more secular and philosophical areas of Tantra, not so much talking about rituals and devata worship, divinity worship, deity worship. I was wondering, how do you relate to those practices and if you do them and so on? Yeah, I don't do them as much as I used to. I do, as of very recently, I was doing full moon ritual, new moon ritual, puja of various kinds, para puja, para mandala puja, and what can I say? These tantric rituals are interesting to those to whom they're interesting. They're not what people tend to imagine, right? Because the vast majority of tantric rituals are simply pujas. There's nothing particularly exciting or shocking or unusual about them. They're much like any other form of Hindu or Buddhist puja, ritual worship. So anyway, the question wasn't very specific, so that's all I will say about it for now. And I'm just getting warmed up here and waiting for people to join the live broadcast. I see 2 of you. Hello. 3 of you. Let's get into a more in-depth question, little by little here. Felipe says, Tantra has integrated the Ashtanga Yoga of Patanjali and its Yamas and Niyamas and added a few more angas, limbs or aids of yoga, aids to yoga. Would you kindly brief the tantric view regarding yamas and niyamas? Well, I will say 2 things about this. In most tantric texts on yoga, on spiritual practice, we see a kind of injunction that the practitioner should have attained some degree of self-mastery before embarking upon tantric practice. So there's this assumption that's sometimes articulated in the texts, usually just right at the beginning of the yoga chapters, where it says something like, the practitioner who has mastered himself, who has self-control, is stable and calm and curious, should find an appropriate place to practice and sit in appropriate posture. And this is how, the chapters often begin. Now, if they elaborate on what this means, well, it's a bit of a paradox, actually, because oftentimes it'll be like, one who is no longer a slave to his anger, one who is no longer subject to compulsive desire, one who is free from fear and discontent, one who is fully self-controlled and tranquil. Such a one should practice yoga. And you're like, well, it sounds like such a one already has the goal of yoga. So there's this paradox, and to what extent is this self-conscious on the part of the tradition that this sort of paradoxical language is utilized? One is it's almost saying one who is dwelling in the state of yoga can practice yoga, but I mean, I don't know how to explain it. It's not something that the tradition ever sort of self-consciously addresses. Um, but very rarely are the yamas and niyamas mentioned at all in tantric sources. But we do have this one, right, tantric source many of you guys know about, the Śāradā-Tilaka, the mark, like a tilak is like a forehead mark, uh, the, the ornamental mark of the autumnal goddess, Śārada, sort of considered a form of Saraswati, and goddess of autumn. That's the name of this text, Śāradā-Tilaka. And this text was composed maybe in 1100 or 1200, something like that. And it lists these double yamas and niyamas, 10 yamas, 10 niyamas. And so these are what I have previously called the tantric yamas and niyamas. But that label might have led some people to believe that these are found ubiquitously in tantric sources instead of one or two, you know. Now this list is copied by the Hatha Pradipika, better known as the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, a sort of classic and important source text for Hatha Yoga and then for modern yoga as well. And so the Hatha Pradipika is a compilation text. There's no original material in that. It's just copying verses from earlier texts and compiling them. And so it copies these yamas and niyamas from this tantric text, the Śāradā-Tilaka. So maybe 4 of these 20 are the same as in Patanjali's text. Ahimsa, Satya, Asteya, Brahmacharya, they're the same. Shaucha is there, so there's at least 5 that are the same. Oh, Santosha is there, so there's at least 6 that are the same. But a whole bunch of them are different from Patanjali's text, right? So we have things like Hri, humility, and Mati, self-reflection, and Dhriti, calm constancy, Kshama, patience, forbearance, Arjava, straightforwardness, and many other delightful qualities to contemplate. You know, one might call these qualities of the heart. So 20 in total, and including, some that are distinctly, kind of different in character or spirit from Patanjali's type yoga, such as Devasya Puja, worship of God, or doing puja to divinities or divinity, homa, japa, siddhanta shravana, listening to the teachings. So there's just giving some examples of, distinctly Shaiva or distinctly theistic, one might say, yamas and niyamas in that list. So anyway, if you take that list, it does perhaps constitute a more complete set of ethical guidelines than Patanjali's yamas and niyamas, but really kind of moral ethical conduct is not a central preoccupation in the Tantras. It's never really advocated for. Rather, what's advocated for is self-control, that you have the ability to, when you're sort of deeply influenced by your samskaras, nowadays we say triggered, to not let them get the better of you, to not become possessed in the language of the tradition. When you're possessed by your own samskaras, the kind of psychological impressions of unresolved past experiences, when they speak for you and through you. When you're possessed by them, they sort of take you over and you find yourself saying things that you later regret. This is considered a sign, no, you're not ready to practice yoga. Like that fundamental level of self-discipline is super important, that you can, not be taken over by those charged psychological states. And it's not about not feeling them, it's not about suppressing them, it's about not being possessed by them as a prerequisite for the practice of yoga in many, many texts. So that's stressed and highlighted rather more often, much more often than Yamas and Niyamas. As you guys know, Tantra is it's not a religion, you're right, it's not a moralistic religious tradition that teaches people how to be good. That's the business of religion. Tantra didn't see itself as a religion, but rather as a spiritual practice which could be embedded within any given religion. And therefore, the missing pieces of, life and conduct and, life passage rituals and death rituals and all this sort of stuff are to be supplied by the religion within which tantric practice is embedded. So it's not that they didn't care at all about ethical and moral guidelines. It's that they were presumed to be supplied by whatever religion one's tantric practice was tied to. Okay, so this is unlike yoga, right? So in the case of classical yoga of Patanjali, one could perform that yoga in an atheistic context or in a theistic context, and Patanjali makes that clear. But Tantra is not so construed or so constituted, right? There's no examples of Tantra practiced in a non-religious context. It's always tied to some specific religion, whether it's a mostly atheistic religion like Buddhism, sure, but still Buddhism is very much a religion. Whereas classical yoga doesn't necessarily need to be tied to any religion at all. So that's just a little bit about that question. There's much more that could be said. Tracy says, can you expound on how this view of non-duality here in Tantra is not transcendental? I've heard an argument that at a subtle level, viewing a pure essence as the core of existence, even if embodied experience is an expression of it, promotes transcendence or transcendental thinking. Yeah. Well, Tantra is not trying to completely avoid being transcendental. In fact, Tantra criticizes those kaulas, those kaula practitioners who are totally pantheistic, meaning those who argue that nature is God and God is nature, and there's nothing more to the divine than nature itself, than the material universe. The material universe should be venerated as divine, but there's no transcendent aspect to the divine according to these kaula practitioners, which members of these non-dual Trika lineages criticized. So in other words, as I talked about in another video, the non-dual Trika or Trika Krama view is precisely that the divine is more than meets the eye, and yet everything the eye can meet. The divine is wholly transcendent and wholly immanent at the same time, meaning the divine does manifest as all that the senses contact, but also as something beyond the mind and beyond the senses. So that's a very, very crucial definition here that so what some people call panentheism, that the one or divine consciousness, whatever you want to call it, is simultaneously the whole of manifest reality, but also something indefinably more. Vishvotirna and Vishvarupa, or Vishwatma. The divine is transcendent and immanent. Okay? So, we don't need to avoid this sort of criticism. Now, if somebody thinks that the argument that there is a pure essence of things means we become transcendentalists and sort of spiritual bypassers. Well, that's just not true, or not necessarily true anyway. Part of the question hinges on what do we mean by pure essence, because pure is too easily construed by those, conditioned by Western religions to mean, pure is something like good. It's opposite of sinful. But here, pure just means the unchanging aspect of consciousness. Unchanging is not quite satisfactory. The indestructible aspect, as it were, the undamageable aspect, that which remains ever itself, that aspect of consciousness which remains perfectly itself and sort of unchanging, even though there's another aspect of it that is constantly changing, right? We could say Shiva and Shakti if we want to give them names. Consciousness becomes the substance of experience, the substance of every moment of experience, all that is, and yet it's not exhausted by that transformation, meaning it doesn't become the whole of, how do I put this? It's not that consciousness transforms the whole of itself into the substance of every experience. There's an aspect of it that remains ever untransformed. The problem is it seems to be impossible to talk about this without implying that consciousness is thereby divided into two parts, a changing part and an unchanging part. And it's really not divided at all. So it's just a feature of the language we're using to try to talk about this. More could be said about that, but today I think we'll just try to hit as many questions as we can. Jared asks in the live feed, did I understand correctly that Tantric Yoga practice cannot be undertaken if someone is in recovery from addiction? Well, the problem with that is it depends what we mean by recovery, because people in the program, like AA or NA, they tend to use the language of recovery indefinitely. They'll say, I'm a recovering alcoholic, even if they haven't had a drink for 20 years. That's a language that those folks use to keep from going back to their addiction, right? So from the point of view of the tradition, it's only if you're like right in the thick of it, right in the thick of trying to disentangle yourself from this addictive behavior, that it's not appropriate to start in on a practice of Tantric Yoga. You need a certain degree of stability. So that's kind of up to you and your teacher. When have you stabilized sufficiently that you can come to the practice? Maybe a year and a half or something after your struggle. If that's the right word for it. Let's go back to the question list. Felipe says, Tarka, discernment, and forgiveness, how do they relate under a tantric perspective? Is it okay to not forgive something or someone even though you already digested the hatred and pain? Well, that's a curious question. I would say it's impossible to not forgive someone or something even though you already digested the hatred and pain. Forgiveness occurs naturally of its own accord. I hope, Felipe, you aren't confusing forgiveness with something you say to somebody. True forgiveness has nothing to do with whether you say anything to anybody, right? It has to do with a shift in your own heart. It doesn't need to be articulated to the other person. That really depends on a lot of other factors, you know. So forgiveness is the softening and opening of the heart and a realization that, you know, you've also done things that people find it hard to forgive, and that we are all in that same boat together, and that the person who did the thing that really hurt you couldn't have done otherwise in that moment, given what they were dealing with. And so forgiveness is a beautiful, natural process that is healing for the one experiencing it. It's not about, you know, the one that you are forgiving, right? You forgive always for your own sake, not for someone else's sake. Okay, moving on from that. Alyssa asked this question, kind of sparked by Deepak Chopra. I can't even pronounce his name correctly. It's a Hindi name. It's not a Sanskrit name. It's hard to say. Chopra. Anyway, not that any American pronounces it right, but still I like to try. I'd like to ask about money and the notion of abundance consciousness. Chopra's teachings have such great appeal worldwide, and I wonder if that's another example of a near enemy or just a completely misleading idea altogether. Probably more the second variety, second option. Alyssa says, I've done his popular 21 Days of Abundance challenge, and it has been helpful in many ways. But since I've read your near enemy posts and took part in the webinars, where you so compellingly dispel the ideas of manifesting, of free will and choice, and also say that being in alignment and finding your purpose doesn't automatically bring you money. She's paraphrasing me there. She says, I'm a bit confused, therefore, and curious whether the notion of money has any place or relevance at all in tantric spiritual teachings. Well, if you put it that way, then the answer is easy. No. Money has no place or relevance at all in the tantric spiritual teachings. But neither is it denigrated, as it is in some pre-modern Christian teachings. Okay, going on with Alyssa's question. Some books on abundance mindset invite their readers to depart from the unhelpful belief that money and spirituality don't go together. Well, sure, I support that, right? And that desiring material comfort does not cancel out one's spiritual work. I support that too, up to a limit. So look, the thing is that the default value is like, when in doubt, epistemic humility. Epistemic humility means that you know that you probably don't know, and that holding a belief is, you know, nearly always a bad idea, unless it's a belief that's been sort of organically evolved on the basis of careful observation of your direct experience, you know. So what I'm saying here is that I would deny and repudiate the notion that money or financial prosperity has any sort of direct relation to spiritual freedom or spiritual practice. But I would also deny that money and spirituality don't go together, right? So, you know, when in doubt, deny all assertions and practice epistemic humility, openness, lack of firmly held opinion, right? Again, that doesn't mean, it's very important actually that you contemplate your direct experience and, and carefully and organically evolve understandings on the basis of your direct experience, right? So it doesn't, this is not, I'm not advocating for some kind of epistemic nihilism, right? We can't know anything and all knowledge is bullshit and, you know, there's no point to trying to formulate any principles at all. That's nihilism. I'm advocating for humility, right? We have to be very careful in formulating opinions or views or principles, but it's worth doing. It's just most people want to jump forward in that process too soon, you know. But anyway, the point here is there's no incompatibility of financial prosperity and spirituality. And there's no necessary contingency either. It's not the case that the more spiritually developed you are, the more money you'll make. Now, it can look like that, though. It can look like some people who, you know, became more spiritually developed also became more prosperous and successful materially or financially. Why would that be the case? Why would I say it can look like that? Well, simply because the process of spiritual development can include the dawning of insights that allow for the release of various forms of contraction or habitual behavioral patterns that were not beneficial, right? So simply as a side effect of one's practice, it can happen that you are able to just let go of stuff you've been holding on to, and you're able to see your inherent worth and value as an existent sentient being, and you're able to, dare I say it, love yourself more, and that can just translate, you know, into many different things, but it can translate into greater success because you're not getting in your own way, right? But this is not really causal. This is just more of a byproduct. So there's no guarantee, right? So just a little bit about that. That's another big topic. And for more on that, you know, see the webinar, You Create Your Own Reality in the Near Enemies series. Layla asks, I'd like your thoughts on the shaktipāta intensive offered by Gurumayi Chidvilāsānanda. Didn't you receive dīkshā in this lineage? Yes. If you're already experiencing a bit too intense energy, she asks, is this something that could make it worse or smoothen it out? I had a little discussion with a friend about whether smoothen was a word. And I said, no, it's not a word. We say smooth it out. And I looked it up, and in fact, it is a word in Indian English. Smoothen is a legitimate form in Indian English. So she won that little debate and got double points for the irony of the fact that I didn't know the Indian English usage. But anyway. Now, what's interesting is that in the Siddha Yoga tradition, currently represented by Gurumayi Chidvilāsānanda, the categories of dīkshā, initiation, and shaktipāta, the sort of descent of grace, are conflated. They're conflated, meaning to say they're equivalent terms. They're synonymous terms. Shaktipāta and dīkshā. They're put together and they're considered synonymous, which is not the case in the original Tantric tradition. They are distinct terms with distinct meanings in the original Tantric tradition. And shaktipāta, the descent of grace or spontaneous initial spiritual awakening, is what qualifies you for initiation in the original tradition. And we're going to get into this in more detail later today on the Patreon webinar. So I'll just give a quick plug for that in just 90 minutes. We'll have our Patreon webinar, which is the beginning of a new series of Patreon webinars. So it's a great time to join Patreon if you were thinking about it. We're starting this new series, which will go on for a few months today. And we're going to get into this exact topic about shaktipāta, or the so-called descent of power or descent of grace. It can be pronounced shaktipāta as well, and even shaktinipāta, and its relation to dīkshā or initiation, and how those are different in the original tradition from modern, how they're understood in modern lineages, not only Siddha Yoga, but some others as well. But Layla's question was, if you're experiencing a bit too intense energy, could a Shaktipāta intensive, which is an event offered annually by Siddha Yoga through video, I guess, or there might be some live elements. Are there live? It's a live broadcast. Okay, but yeah. So Gurumayi herself doesn't appear, or hasn't for some years, in that intensive, but she blesses it with her sankalpa, her intention. But anyway, so it's a live broadcast, not video, that they do once a year. And the point, coming finally to Layla's question, if you're experiencing too intense energy or kind of intense kundalini symptoms, would it make it worse or smoothen it out? And I said, probably smoothen it out, or smooth it out. Because if your kundalini is overactive or doing weird things, like going up the wrong channel, as some people put it sometimes, being in the presence of either a kundalini master or somebody with great attainment, or even just other practitioners whose kundalini has stabilized, being in the presence of those folks can really smooth and calm your whole process. So in general, that's recommended, even though you might think, oh gosh, I don't want to go into a high intensity environment when I already have too much intensity. Well, first of all, Siddha Yoga meditation intensives are not high intensity these days compared to previous years and compared to many other things you could go on. And second of all, no, it tends to stabilize the energy when you're around other people who've been through Kundalini awakening and who now have a stable situation. So yeah, I would recommend it, really, for probably anyone who's having Kundalini crisis. Or, I mean, the thing about Kundalini crisis is you have to kind of sometimes do your due diligence and make sure that it's not a psychophysical issue, right? That it's not temporary derangement due to some physical issue, or that it's not incipient psychosis due to, unstable psyche. Sometimes people have this going on, something like incipient psychosis, and they think it's Kundalini, and it's really not. But if it is Kundalini and it's overactive or kind of too intense, then yeah, a meditation intensive with any great master will help. If I mention someone on the Tibetan side, it may be somebody, I'm just trying to think of people who are currently active out there offering programs. Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche might be another example of somebody you could sit with and who's gonna stabilize your energy. Wangyal, Wangyal. Much less famous, but very accomplished master of all kind of energy practices is this guy Lair Short in Taos, New Mexico. I don't know where you are. Others could be mentioned. Moving on. Bikram mumukshu. That means one who longs for liberation. Says, I came across Buddhist teaching, and at a point the teacher said to me that it is necessary to take refuge in Buddhism. Further, he said that the gods or deity which Hindus worship can't lead to liberation, as God or Īshwara himself is not free from the cycle of birth and death. Well, he would say that, wouldn't he? Only the Bhagavan Buddha can lead to nirvana. Can you please share your thoughts in light of Tantrik Yoga? If somebody talks this way, avoid them. Walk away. Or perhaps run for the hills. Right? This is the standard sort of talk that people do when they are what we call triumphalists. Scholars use this term, a triumphalist, somebody who thinks their path is the only way. It's not only the best way, it's the only way. You know, we have lots of Christians like this, of course, in Western culture. You know, they like to quote this passage from Gospel of John, and Jesus said, nobody comes to the Father except through me. So you can't be saved unless you accept Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior, according to those people who are interpreting that passage from John. John, by the way, being a gospel that scholars have established, was written in the year 130, when Jesus died in like the year 30. So unlikely to be quoting him very accurately, just saying, from a historical point of view. Of course, Christians don't accept that argument. But anyway, that was just another example of people saying, no, this is the one true path. So that kind of dogma has nothing to do with spiritual awakening, cannot contribute to your spiritual awakening, so you have nothing to gain from such a teacher. Now, to address a couple of points in the specific claim here, you know, Īshwara, I mean, it's precisely the opposite definition of Īshwara as given in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, that Īshwara is a soul exactly like any other soul, that Īshwara is a soul just like you, except he has never been bound. He has never been bound in the cycle of birth and death, let alone not being free from it. Okay, so that's the teaching in the Yoga Sutra, that again, Īshwara is identical to your soul in every way, except has never suffered the illusion of bondage, whereas you are currently suffering the illusion of bondage. So therefore, Īshwara is you know, a power that you could appeal to. Now, this is a different conception of Īshwara than the Tantrikas have, of course, quite a different conception. But anyway, what that person said, I would say, is nonsense. And there's many different forms of Buddhism, many different forms of Hinduism, many different forms of, you know, Shaivism and Vaishnavism. So please don't presume, any of you, please don't presume that you know anything about a tradition based on what one person says about it, or one whole lineage says about it, because there are many subdivisions called sampradayas within these isms, right? Like Hinduism and Shaivism, and the sampradayas themselves subdivide into lineages, and any lineage might be articulating itself in a very different way from some other lineage. So if somebody meets, you know, a dogmatic tantrika, and believe me, they are out there. These dogmatic tantrikas who claim, no, only our lineage preserves the true, clear, accurate teaching, and all others are corrupt. You know, and then you might be like, man, I met a tantrika once, they're just dogmatic jerks. Well, that one was, but people are just way too hasty to sort of tar everyone with the same brush, as the expression goes. But really, there's enormous diversity in the tradition. I'm coming to Ekat's question, which I'm afraid I probably just don't have an answer to, but I'll read it anyway. Recently, I've been struggling with the seeming unfairness of grace and the idea that some people seem to never even seem to get the opportunity to wake up out of suffering in their lives and spend their whole lives in painful contraction. They don't get the grace to meet a teacher or receive liberating teachings. How does the tradition explain this? The tradition doesn't try to explain this, because the question itself is, even though you've done tons of work to be free of Western religious paradigms, you're still not free of Western religious paradigms, like most people, like most Westerners in the group. It really takes even more work than you think, right? So the supposition here is, again, kind of based in some notion, perhaps even just subconscious notion, of grace as a kind of act of God, and God as a supernatural person and a superhuman being who dispenses grace. And so the very phrase, the unfairness of grace, is only possible in the context of that sort of view, where there's a superhuman being who, gives out the grace, even if you don't think that ever, you don't have that thought. In this case, I know the person asking the question, and I'm sure she doesn't think that thought, right? But still, the supposition is somehow there. That there's some kind of design, right? Even if it's not exactly a person, that there's some kind of design behind who receives grace and who doesn't, right? Even the very phrase "receive grace" is potentially problematic. We might be more useful to ask the question about, in terms of opening, who opens to grace and who doesn't. Now, see, that suddenly shifts the agency, right? Because receive grace implies there's some force out there trying to give it to you, and that and you are one of the blessed ones and not somebody else. Whereas open to grace implies that grace is a universal power of some kind that we need to learn how to open to, and it's up to us. This would be more accurate to the tradition to use this sort of language. Why does one person open to grace and not another? Okay, so there's definitely no sense of sort of one person is chosen and another not. But still, why does a person open and another not? Is it just their karma? Ekat asks. Well, yeah, that's going to be the default go-to for the tradition in explaining this. Why does one person open to grace and another not? Because they're not ready to open to grace yet. Why are they not ready? Because karma. And when they say because karma, it's kind of admitting they've run out of explanations, because what does karma mean? Causes and conditions. It's the entire causal network of reality. Everything has causes and conditions if we're looking at things within linear time, and all those causes and conditions have causes and conditions. So because karma is an accurate enough answer, but also not very explanatory. You almost might say, because things are the way they are, so ultimately we maybe just don't have a satisfying explanation. But Ekat and others who struggle with this, I would invite you to examine and hopefully release this notion of fairness. It's not fair, or it doesn't seem fair, maybe the universe isn't fair. Well, fairness is a mental construct. Fairness only exists in human minds, So it's not really fair to say that the universe is unfair, right? The universe can't be unfair if fairness is just a construct in human minds, not a property of things in reality, When I was younger, I was really into wolves. They were one of the animals I was super into. And, I studied all about wolves and how wolves actually, I would defend wolves to people who are like, wolves are dangerous animals and they should be shot, and I'd be like, no, because they actually improve the genetic uh, quality of the herd, because when wolves chase deer or caribou or other prey animals, they can only catch the old or crippled or sick animals, and therefore they strengthen the genetic integrity of the herd by taking out the old and sick and crippled animals from the herd. Except they can also catch the young ones, right? Well, that doesn't seem fair, right? The young ones are just not as fast, whereas the ones that are old, sick, and crippled are, they have a genetic, there's a genetic benefit to them to the wolves taking them out, but there's no genetic benefit to the herd of the wolves taking out the young ones. Really, they'll just take whatever they can get, the wolves, because they're hungry. you know. So you can look at a wolf catching an old sick member of the herd and feel, that's the order, that's the natural order of things, and everything is so harmonious because it's good for the herd too. But then you see the wolf catching the little baby deer, and I've seen it, a little baby deer, and you go, oh, no, I don't want a little baby deer to be eaten, not Bambi. That's not fair, right? But the universe is not designed wrong. It's not designed wrong if it doesn't appeal to how you would like things to be, or how any of us might like things to be. None of us want little baby animals with big, cute doe eyes to be eaten, but they are. Do you think that's somehow wrong? So just reflect on this. That phrases like, "Oh, that makes the universe seem cruel." When you use a phrase like that, and I'm just going to be strong with you here, ECAT, and many others I know who speak this way. When you use a phrase like, "That makes the universe seem cruel or not fair," you are simply still thinking in terms of your Judeo-Christian notion of God, but you're just using the phrase "the universe" in place of the word God. The universe is just everything. The universe is literally just everything. It's all the things and all the physical laws that govern the interactions of all the things. And the universe is pattern too, but it's not something that could be cruel or fair or unfair, right? So there's a projection that happens of our, again, our sort of Western enculturated, primarily Judeo-Christian conception of God that needs to be, according to this tradition, that needs to be really expunged from your system. Because yes, we do use the word God in this tradition, but it's different. It's not that sort of God, really. It's not the master planner, designer, sitting on top of the cosmic hierarchy pyramid and deciding this is how things are going to be. And they could be another way. I could make a universe in which the wolves don't eat the baby deer, but I'm going to have them eat the baby deer because I like to fuck with people. No, there's no such God, and no such universe, right? The universe is not a person. A person has the capacity to be cruel or fair or unfair, but the universe is not a person. So the objection doesn't stand. Sorry if that's, a confronting contemplation, but it's a good one. And see, you can hear the teaching over and over again, but then you just spend enough time talking to other people in California, and boom, there comes that language again. The universe is teaching me a lesson. That was going to be a near enemy. I didn't get a chance to write it, right? The universe is giving me a sign or teaching me a lesson. I just couldn't summon the inspiration to comment on that. But it is a near enemy. It's just not a particularly close near enemy. It's a more distant near enemy, so it doesn't inspire me so much. Ekat says, she's now responding, isn't karma all about fairness? Cause and effect as a kind of fair process. Well, that's how people justify the teaching of karma. That's how people explain it. But no, the teaching of karma is that actions have reactions. That there's action and reaction, and that over time, if you keep doing shitty things, it's very likely that you're gonna come to a bad end. Not that there's ever an end, right? But it's just a figure of speech, There's going to be blowback from all the shitty things you do sooner or later. That's a very common sense principle. And if you keep doing virtuous things, there's going to be positive blowback from that. And it doesn't mean that good things are going to magically start happening to you. It means that on balance, there's really good reasons to do good things, and by good it's a shorthand, right? Because there's nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so. And yet there are actions that are more or less beneficial to others. That is to say, there are actions that tend to increase the well-being of conscious creatures, and there are actions that tend to reduce the well-being of conscious creatures, and we call these beneficial and harmful actions respectively. So we can even say good or bad if we understand that that's what we mean, that there's no morality is just a human invention. There's no morality, but there are actions that on balance tend to increase the well-being of conscious creatures. And if you perform those actions, you'll generally be really happy you did somewhere down the line. There's all kinds of unexpected ways that they come back around and benefit you. And if you consistently perform actions that reduce the well-being of other conscious creatures, you're gonna generally regret that in one way or another, and possibly in multiple ways. That's the real teaching of karma, And then people will raise objections to it that are anecdotal. They'll be like, Trump does every goddamn bad thing, and it never comes back to haunt him. Really, though, does it? Does it not? Or when you look beneath the surface, do you not see a being there who's suffering enormously, who's been suffering for so long that he doesn't even know what happiness is anymore? Doesn't even know what joy means, right? Anyway, I think there will be further blowback for that particular individual. But it doesn't matter. Whatever anecdotal evidence you give, what about this person or that person, it doesn't change the fact that karma is not some kind of immutable law. Guaranteed, if you do 10 bad things will happen to you. It's not that. It's more like what I was talking about, that in general, we can say it's perfectly true that these will be the results. Okay? Now, is that fair? Is that because the universe was set up to be fair? No, that's not because God manufactured a universe in some way, or that the universe even spontaneously sprang into being in such a way that we could call it fair, right? That's all just story, Is the fact that karma generally holds for most beings, is that an example of fairness? I would say no, that's just your story. It's not an example of anything except what it is, But yes, we can at least imagine a universe in which it didn't necessarily hold. Maybe there's some other universe in which you consistently act in such a way as to increase the well-being of conscious creatures, and it doesn't tend to have, a positive blowback or knock-on effects that you like. I mean, I can't imagine how that would work, right? Because when you act in such a way as to increase the well-being of conscious creatures, there's obvious thing. There's like the fact that people are grateful and then they want to do nice things for you, but there's also countless complex, these are human social and cultural systems are complex systems. They're chaotic systems in the good sense of that word, right? The chaos theory, right? They're so incredibly complex that you can't even predict how and when the little kind of domino falls that you set going are going to circle back around to you in extraordinarily unexpected ways that'll feel magical at the time, but actually make perfect sense if we could really just understand more. Anyway, that's good for now, I guess. That's maybe the rant of the day. Moving on. Got to wrap it up soon because I got to prepare for the Patreon webinar. I mean, I have been preparing, but I want to prepare a little more. Some things I don't prepare for, but when translation is involved, preparation is needed. Lee Sullivan asks, I remember a teaching from you about the void being beyond everything, beyond consciousness, beyond God. No, I didn't say that. Maybe that was someone else. Lee is sort of asking about the relationship between the void, the shunya or mahashunya, and divine consciousness. Well, this is explained not as in-depth as I would like, but it is explained in Tantra Illuminated in the section on the 5-layered self, nested layers of consciousness, where the relation between the void and divine consciousness or pure awareness is addressed. So briefly, we could say, look, the void, which sounds like a thing when you put a the in front of it, the void, sounds like a thing. But by definition, it's the absence of all things, so it can't be a thing, You can have this experience in meditation of nothingness, just total, unrelenting silence, just negation of all activity and all existence, really. And some people find that experience terrifying, and other people find it a blessed relief. They're beautiful. It's the same experience. It's just an experience of no-thingness. But different psychology reacts differently to it, But when you encounter the void and go further in meditation, then you discover what these, Shaiva Tantrikas are talking about, which is the infinite space of still, silent presence. Because when you're in the void initially, you don't notice that it's filled with presence because you sort of negate yourself in a certain way. You don't notice that you're there in the void. I mean, you're not there in the sense of body or mind because there's no body and there's no mind, or else it's not a void experience at all. And you're in the void, there's no body and mind. There's no thought, there's no emotion, and yet there's still consciousness there, presencing the experience. Now that is not, before that's integrated, it's sort of just like you versus the void, you versus the abyss. And it's terrifying, as Nietzsche said, if you stare into the abyss looks also into you. And it seems to negate your entire existence and all existence. But then you sort of go through the eye of the needle, as it were, and you discover that the void is permeated by still silent presence, quiet presence. And this presence quietly pulsates. I mean, the pulsation is almost imperceptible compared to any other experience you could have. It's like no energy at all. But it's this very, very, very subtle pulsation that the tradition characterizes as aham, I am. But it's not the thought, it's not even the feeling I am. It's way more subtle than that. But it's the pulsation of consciousness itself, free of all experience, free of all objects, and free of the need to experience any object. Just quietly reposing in itself, you might say, free of all objects of experience. And then once that's recognized, that can be recognized in all things. That still silent presence can be discovered everywhere, in everything. Even while you're experiencing body and wind and trees and annoying people and lovely cats or whatever it is that you're experiencing. None of that, even slightly, impedes the experience of the infinite, still, silent presence. There's nothing that could happen in the present moment, no event, no violence, nothing that could even touch the still, silent presence, let alone cover it up or impede it. But it seems otherwise. A lot of people touch into that and then they lose it again. And this is a very mysterious topic. We'll have to address it in another discussion. How it's the case that it's never lost, but it seems to be lost. How it's the case that still silent presence is never covered up or impeded, and yet seems to be inaccessible even to one who's tasted it for a moment. Yeah, so we're going to have to come back to that one another time. It's pretty important. Sachita Agni Nagini asks about sex workers who call themselves dakas or dakinis, doubtless mispronouncing these words. They're doubtless saying dakini, which is itself a clue. But these sex workers who call themselves by these Sanskrit words, and perhaps don't call themselves sex workers, by the way. They might call themselves tantric cultivators or tantric practitioners or any number of things. And there's no pejorative connotation whatsoever here to the words, the phrase sex worker. By that we simply mean someone who offers sexual touch or sexual stimulation and is paid for that work. There's nothing wrong with it, but it is sex work. And these folks who call themselves dakas and dakinis, whether or not they're sex workers, if they're part of that neo-tantra world, the usage of the term has no connection to the usage of these terms in classical tantra. Dakini is a term in classical tantra that's more or less synonymous with yogini, which itself is used in a very different way from the modern usage of yogini. This is a big, complex topic that you can read about. Yoginis and dakinis are like female magic spirits. They're semi-divine beings. They're demigods, demigoddesses. that you can call on in practice, that you can ally yourself with, but they're considered dangerous. They can be your allies, they can be your spirit guides, but if you don't know how to relate to them and you fuck up, then they can eat you alive and devour all your life force. So generally not the sort of spirits you want to invoke unless you really know what you're doing. This obviously has very little to do with this other usage of the term, unless, of course, you're dealing with somebody who is just like that. There's a kind of matrika shakti effect that can happen where you use an ancient Sanskrit word for something in a way that in another way, but it ends up having an effect related to its actual meaning. I don't want to get into that topic right now, but yeah. So someone in the group, Florian, speculates that this misappropriation of the term dakini as dakini goes back to Osho and found its way into Neo-Tantra as an appeal to spiritual authority to legitimize practices that were actually more properly rooted in Reichian work and entail a very blurry boundary with spiritualized sex work. Well, that certainly sounds like an intelligent comment. I don't know if it's true, but got to wrap it up now. There's more interesting questions. There's a lot more interesting questions. Okay, well, I guess we'll hit a couple more as quickly as possible. These are going to be inadequate answers, right? But Mary mentions page 189 of Tantra Illuminated, where the 12 Kālīs or 12 Kālikas are mentioned and not explained on purpose, and asks about their relationship with Kālī and Parā-Vac or Parā-Vac or Parā-Devi. So the 12 Kālīs are emanations of Mahakāli. The 12 Kālīs are Kālikas, little Kālīs, but that's more an affectionate term. It's not a diminutive, it's an affectionate term. The 12 Kālikas are emanations of Mahakāli, so that makes 13 in total, technically, but the 13th Kālī is not separate from the 12. She emanates as the 12. She subsumes the 12. She's not a separate Kālī. And these 12 are explained in various sources, like the Kramastotra and the Tantra Loka and Tantra Sara. And I have a Patreon webinar explaining the 12 Kālīs. And in some depth, as far as I know, no one has ever published anything explaining them in even as much depth as that Patreon webinar does, let alone more. So it's a desideratum for the tradition, for sure, to have some more publications on this, because they're very, very, very profound teaching that people, I think, have been hesitant to publish on because it's so refined and subtle and complex and easy to get wrong. Now, for the Kaulatrika lineage of Abhinavagupta, which is Krama influenced, Kālī and Parā are two sides of the same coin. They're aspects of each other. Kālī is the black hole, if you will, and Parā is the white hole. Now, that physics terminology is now out of date because physicists have sort of given up on the idea that black holes have corresponding white holes somewhere else in the universe. But it's a metaphorical usage of the term. It doesn't require the literal existence of white holes. Moving on, because I want to just at least touch on Glenn's question about discernment. You know, he's alluding to this teaching of Adyashanti and others that says just sit on a bench and wait until your body spontaneously moves off the bench and see what it does. And he says, but what if an action arises spontaneously that would be considered bad, like a pedophile wanting to go to a child? Would such action just not arise in this context? Because, I mean, there's a lot that's being presumed in this question that's not articulated around pratibha, right? Pratibha as kind of spontaneous, intuitive sense or intuition. You know, that it's pratibha that gets you up off the bench if you're doing this practice in which I won't get off the bench or the couch until something other than my mind moves me, then the presumption is it's pratibha that moves you, your intuitive sense. And so he says, would such action just not arise? Meaning, would pratibha never prompt a pedophile to go to a child? And he goes on, and what if that pedophile has some constitution that makes him or her attracted to children? Would they need to learn over time by experience, seeing the results of their actions? This should really be a whole webinar in and of itself. Maybe a full hour would be enough to begin to answer this question. But first of all, yes, of course, I mean, a pedophile is someone who has a constitution that makes them attracted to children. That's what it is. That's what that word means. So there's a lot of confusion around this word because people think pedophile means someone who molests children. No. That's a sexual abuser or a child molester who's also a pedophile, right? But a pedophile is literally someone who's attracted to children whether they like it or not. So as any sane pedophile will tell you, it's a horrible curse to be attracted to children, you know, and not adults. And there are such people, and I've read some articles by them, very interesting, and that's a very tragic thing to have to struggle with. But there are plenty of lots and lots of moral, sane pedophiles who don't touch children because they know it would hurt the children. And so they just have to deal with the fact that they need to be celibate in this life. Or maybe they'll someday be attracted to adults. It could happen, right? So I would argue that yes, if that pedophile, again defined as someone attracted to children, is abiding in their essence nature, then it's impossible that they would receive some prompting to go to a child, because they might feel the attraction very strongly, just like any of us can feel angry or upset or pain or even hatred, right? Any of us can feel hatred of the kind that prompts some humans to be violent without being violent, right? So we're not different from the pedophile. Let's be clear. There is no kind of human who's unforgivably different or monstrous. No such thing. We're all just like that person, because any of us have felt emotion that in others translates to violent action, and yet we've managed to not be violent, you know? So that person can manage to feel what they feel and not act on it. But where did they acquire the strength to not act on it? This atma bala, this inner strength is what the tradition calls it. When you abide in essence nature, even for a moment, it confers upon the body-mind, even if only for a moment, this inner strength, this atma bala, to not act on an impulse that you know is harmful. Now, those who don't have access to this, to essence nature, everyone does actually, but let me revise it. Those who don't have frequent or consistent access to essence nature and therefore don't have access to this Atma Bala, this inner strength, they need to learn over time by experience. They need to learn by seeing, I did it, and the effect was bad. Harm was caused. And of course, some people don't learn from that because they just exist in denial. They don't let themselves look at the harm they caused, or they don't acknowledge that it is harm. But there's a lot of people in this middle ground, who they need to learn by experience, and people get hurt in that process, but hasn't it always been true in all of our lives? We've all hurt people, and we've all learned by that process. So again, we're not intrinsically different. So again, that's just an initial response, and even that is not adequate. Like I said, it would take an hour to adequately begin to answer this. So here's the thing, though. Action is not truly spontaneous and free unless you have actually arrived at that point within yourself where you feel deep down nothing needs to be done. Right? There's no compulsion whatsoever. In essence nature, there's no compulsion. There's never a feeling that anything needs to be done. So action is only spontaneous and free when you truly know, at least in that moment, there's nothing I need to do. There's nothing that needs doing. And yet, something in me moves towards action. And in the most basic example, it's just the body wants to sustain itself, Essence nature knows, hey, this body's going to die and there's nothing we can do about it. It's going to die sooner or later. So it doesn't need to be, there's no need to try to sustain the body indefinitely, but the body itself wants to sustain itself. So you could be sitting there and suddenly the body's getting up and it's headed towards some food, and you didn't have a single thought of food in your head. So there's spontaneous action on multiple levels. There's the body taking spontaneous action to nourish itself. So this is the answer to those people, very important, those people who think, if I repose in essence nature, won't I become totally irresponsible? No, because body naturally wants to sustain itself. Just let it do it, and mind gets curious about stuff and learns. It wants to. If you give mind free rein to do nothing, after a while it gets bored and it wants to learn stuff. Okay, so we'll wrap it up there. There were some questions some minutes ago about that whole void consciousness thing. Please read that section in Tantra Illuminated in the categories of tantric thought, subheading nested layers of consciousness, the five-layered self, subheading void. Read from there. Thank you all. Thank you, Atmanidhi and others, for your kind words. And I hope some of you join us on Patreon. Well, many of you have joined, 300 of you, in fact. But I hope a couple more join on Patreon for this wonderful exploration of shaktipāta, or the descent of power, the descent of grace, which triggers our initial spiritual awakening and subsequent kind of major stages in our spiritual process. And that webinar will be starting in 35 or 40 minutes. Om. Take care. Much love.